Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, June 21st. Here are the top stories of the week. Last weekend, leaders of some 90 countries gathered in Switzerland to discuss the prospects for peace in Ukraine. The meeting came just a day after Russian President Vladimir Putin offered a ceasefire, but only if Ukraine agreed to cede 4 provinces to Russia and never join NATO and limit its military forces and demilitarize and denazify. In Switzerland, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky did not think that was the right way to proceed and said the way to end the war is for Russia to remove its troops. The big question: is any negotiation possible? And if so, what would it look like and who would negotiate? Then we'll take a look at the budding relationship between Russia's president and North Korea's dear leader. Putin visited the Hermit Kingdom this week for the first time in 24 years. The country has long been isolated and subject to economic sanctions and an arms embargo, but Russia now needs weapons to fight its war in Ukraine, and it is bringing Pyongyang in from the cold. What will the impact of this new budding relationship be on regional and global stability? And then we'll take a look at the foreign policy of a possible second Trump term. This week in Foreign Affairs, a magazine published by the Council on Foreign Relations, Robert O'Brien, Trump's fourth and last national security advisor, lays out his thoughts about how Trump is likely to engage or not engage the world. We'll discuss some of the ideas and thinking behind O'Brien's article. Here to talk about these issues, there are 3 reporters who cover these stories. Stephen Erlanger, chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for the New York Times; Ken Moriyasu, who is the Washington correspondent for Nikkei Asia; and Nahal Toosi, senior foreign affairs correspondent at Politico. Good morning, good afternoon, all. Wonderful to see you on this Friday. Steve, let's start with you. For once, the news from Ukraine was peace rather than war, although there was plenty of war going on. A peace conference in Switzerland with some 90 countries attending, though we should note Russia was not invited. And that led the Mr. Putin to say, well, I know how to get to peace too. Why don't we just stop fighting and you give me everything I want? It kind of looked like that's where the situation is, but it's a little more than that. That's a little flippant. What happened in the Switzerland meeting, and where do you think things stand when it comes to the prospect for negotiations?
Well, thank you, Ivo. It's a complicated story. I would start with the G7 summit in Bari, which was like a day before the Swiss show, where the G7 agreed to use frozen Russian assets as collateral for a big and very needed quick loan to Ukraine of some $50 billion. And they have to resolve how it's actually done, and it may not come to the end of the year. But Ukraine needs the money, and using Russian assets, which some think should be seized, but at least are frozen, was a clever way of getting money quickly. I mean, if you remember all the fuss in the American Congress about the $61 billion supplemental, which took so long and which starved Ukraine of ammunition, $50 billion on top of that is not so bad. So then you go to the Zelensky summit, which I think was really kind of a PR show. I didn't find it very successful or, frankly, very compelling. First of all, Russia wasn't there. So it's hard to have a peace conference when one of the adversaries isn't there, isn't invited. China wasn't there, which has been a supporter of Russia. Certainly North Korea wasn't there, which has been giving a lot of arms to the Russians, and Iran wasn't there. And it was, in a way, an effort to speak to the global South, but there were countries that didn't really sign on. So, yes, quite a lot of countries came. It was a chance for Ukraine to say, see, we're interested in peace. But I think an opportunity was actually missed. Had they built the summit on the Chinese-Brazilian proposals to begin with, then maybe you would have had China and Brazil there. But more important, I think, is what's coming in Washington soon, which is the NATO summit, the 75th anniversary summit, and what the NATO countries who are supporting Ukraine will provide Ukraine short of membership path, right? So everyone says, oh, yes, down the road, Ukraine will be a member of NATO, but not now, not yet. The Americans and Germans are quite firm about that, but NATO wants to show Ukraine that there's a long-term commitment to its security, to its future, to the so-called, as Jake Sullivan said, bridge to NATO. But underneath all that is a much more realistic discussion, which cannot really be had publicly, I think, until at least after the American presidential election, which is how does realistically Ukraine define success and enter into the Western structure, even if it doesn't regain all of its territory, because very few people believe that it is capable of actually doing that. Right now, for Zelensky, you can't even talk about it. It's politically not to be done. It's a third rail. But Ukraine is building defensive lines. And the only way you could actually get to a negotiation is by continuing to support Ukraine to the point where its military can convince Vladimir Putin that he has gained as much as he can gain. I don't think there'll be serious negotiations until Russia decides it has, won what it's going to win and it can win no more. I mean, then perhaps we can have a realistic discussion. But right now, Ukrainian demands and Russian demands, which you've described very well, are so far apart. The idea of actual negotiations is absurd. So we're in this kind of Gabathon process of summitry. But I think the point is to show Ukraine that the West is with it and with it for the long term, past this president, through the next presidency, and that its future is Western and it won't be abandoned.
I can pick up that last point that Steve mentioned, all of which I think is correct, which is that not only do the parties sort of need to exhaust themselves and see that there's no more further military gain to be had from continuing to fighting, but there's also this question of convincing at least Vladimir Putin that the longer he goes on doesn't mean that the West gets any weaker. And I know that, for example, Japan's prime minister has been very passionate about the importance of Ukraine winning, or at least more importantly, Russia not winning, as a means to enhance security, not just in Ukraine, not just in Europe, but frankly in East Asia as well. So how do you see it? And of course, the Japanese prime minister was in Switzerland, and all the Western leaders were there. So how do you see that they are approaching the countries in Japan, but broadly speaking, the East Asian allies?
Right. So when Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida came to Washington and gave a speech to Congress, one of the messages he had is that we are a global partner. We know that America is tired from having to shoulder the burden of maintaining the international order on its own, but you don't have to be alone. We are with you, and South Korea is with you. So I think this was the message that Japan is not just focusing on its own region, but it is prepared to help America do what it does across the world, which would, in the long term, help Japan's stability as well. I don't agree with that, but that's the Japanese government's position. Also, we're really watching how China is trying to mediate, I think, between Russia and Ukraine. I was very interested about how positive Vladimir Zelensky was at the joint press conference with Biden. At the very end, he was asked, so what do you think about China? Is China part of the crime against Ukraine? And his answer was that I had a phone call with Xi Jinping, and that in that phone call, she gave me his word that China would not offer lethal weapons to Russia, and that if China has an alternative plan, we are all ears, and if that plan is worth debating, there will be a dialogue. And then Biden chimed in and said, well, Putin, China is not offering weapons, but it's offering all the goods that enable Russia to make the weapons. So it is enabling the war. And but rather than nodding to that, Zelensky was shuffling his papers and not really listening to what Biden was saying. It looked like Zelensky was kind of sending a signal to China that he is interested. Whether this phone call that Zelensky talked about with Xi was a recent call, because no call has been announced, disclosed since April 2023. He may be talking about that. The American officials I talked to said they believe that he's talking about this phone call a year ago. But it may have been that there was some kind of interaction more recently in which China expressed its intent to mediate between them. So there was a lot to take, I think, from that press conference.
It's fascinating. I mean, Holly, to chime in here, Nahal, in any way you want. But I also this point on China, I think, is interesting because, of course, this was the first time that the Chinese did not show up at one of these meetings. There have been these meetings at the National Security Council level, advisors level. Now, I think this was the fourth meeting, and the Chinese have been trying to demonstrate that they actually do care about peace by showing up. They didn't show up in this one, and there's a general sense in the United States, I feel, that the Chinese are really decided they're in bed with the Russians on this. They don't want Russia to lose. They're willing to close both eyes to all the defensive industrial capabilities that are being sent across. And there's the idea that China is going to be the solution to this problem may have been the case a year ago, but I don't think many people in Washington think that's the case today. How do you read it?
Yeah, I think the Chinese are looking at a number of factors, including, again, November's election. So much, I think, rides on what happens there. So there is kind of a sense that if Trump wins, we're going to have an even tougher anti-China policy, especially on trade, things like that. So there's not much point right now in Beijing, endangering ties with Russia when there's the possibility that they'll have to deal with an even tougher American policy, economically and otherwise, if Trump wins. And even under Biden, they're already having to deal with one. So I just think it's one of these things where they are like walking a fine line and trying to, maybe they won't show up at this conference, but they might show up at another one. Maybe they don't give weapons, but they give something else that allows Putin to spend, other money on weapons. It's just, they're just trying to play every side at this point. And to me, I think I've talked about this before, is like, their peace proposals don't tend to be very sophisticated. They're often like, it's like bullet points of like how everybody needs to just behave themselves and get along. It doesn't, I don't know that they really add much to the discussion other than just simply their presence. So I wouldn't, if I was Ukraine, I wouldn't say, think China's a lost cause at this stage. And so I can understand why Zelensky acts the way he did. But I think for the United States right now, and for China, so much is just riding on this upcoming election that to try to draw a conclusion about what it means is kind of a challenge. One other point I just want to make is, this idea that there can be a peace with Putin ever is kind of interesting to me because of the sanctions and other penalties put on his country, and because of the way things have realigned, his entire economy now is based on war and having this war continue or some sort of fighting continue. And so I don't think he's ever going to be serious about a real peace because he needs the war to continue so that the economy in Russia functions. Because if the economy completely implodes, that probably is a graver threat to him than anything else. In terms of his own hold on power. So I just, he might make these gestures for peace, but it's hard to believe that he actually wants that in any fashion. And also part of the strategy of the Russian strategy, I think, of saying that they want peace talks is so they can put a proposal out there. And then that brings the West, which wants to see this war end as quickly as possible, that leads the West to put more pressure on Ukraine to bring the war to an end. And it just adds to the kind of, like, if it doesn't happen, then Ukraine is the one that looks bad. And Russia kind of knows this. So they put these proposals out there. But, do they really want peace? I don't buy it. I just think they want something in which Ukraine, bows to them. And they feel like if they put a proposal out there, the West, which wants the war to end, will put all the pressure on Ukraine to end the war.
And that's so interesting, and to that point, which I think it makes sense from Putin's perspective. At the same time, here in Brussels, where Steve and I both are, I just heard from two very senior NATO people that no matter how this war ends, Russia is going to remain a problem, a very, very big problem. And that seems to be, in some ways, I think more so than the United States, the accepted wisdom in Europe. And Steve, you're in Berlin. Even the German chief of staff said in 5 years they will have to have the capability of launching a major campaign against Europe, against NATO. This is sort of now becoming conventional wisdom. Whether Europe is going to do enough to prevent that from happening and to deter it is a different set of issues. But it is pretty striking that there is an assessment now that his war economy makes war inevitable, or at least the push towards war inevitable.
Yeah, and just to say quickly, the war has pushed Putin into something he was heading toward anyway, which is really a decoupling from the West. We often talk about how we should somehow decouple from China, but he has basically turned his back on the West, and he is maneuvering around sanctions, and he's finding other ways to have the economy grow. War economy, yes, but he's selling a lot of oil, and he's selling a lot of natural gas, and he and his central bankers have actually surprised people. So, I don't know how deeply affectionate he and she are, but I do think the days when we even could think of Putin's Russia as cooperative or share in European security, that's over. And Europeans reluctantly, very reluctantly, are, as you say, recognizing this.
I think that's one of the big changes that has happened in the last couple of years, and I think Europe is trying to figure out what the consequences of that are, as are many others. Ken, let's switch over to related, but really in some ways a really interesting development with Vladimir Putin getting on an airplane and landing in Pyongyang airport. He doesn't need armored trains. Apparently, he can just fly. First time since in 24 years he's been there. He was there shortly after he became president in 2000 or 2001. But they came away with a very strong relationship established in the security sphere. What that wasn't just about you give me as much of your artillery shells as I need, but really about a joint military and security arrangement, which of course is a fundamental violation of every UN Security Council resolution that is out there with regard to North Korea. How do you read it, and importantly, what's the impact on the region? We worry about Ukraine, but at the same time, if you're South Korea, you're Japan, where North Korea poses a significant threat. This is not good news.
Well, it's so interesting, as you say, and the big question is this new partnership between North Korea and Russia a game changer? And the answer is I don't think so. But to get there, let's dial back a little bit. So on Wednesday, Putin and Kim Jong-un signed a treaty on comprehensive strategic partnership. which includes a clause that says that if one party comes under an armed invasion, the other party shall provide military and other assistance without delay. And what's interesting is that Kim Jong-un called this a new alliance in the press conference. Putin did not. The North Koreans immediately released the statement in Korean and in English. The Russians did not. And what the Russians did release, it's on the Kremlin website, it's fascinating, when Putin in Hanoi talked to reporters about what he thinks about this new treaty. And Putin says there's nothing new. And he says that the 1961 treaty on friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance was expiring, so they decided to extend it, and that the wording is mostly the same. What is interesting is that the wording is not the same. The 1961 treaty says, in the event of an armed attack, the other party will immediately provide military and other assistance, an armed attack. But the 2024 new one says, in the case of one party is put in a state of war by an armed invasion, then the other party will respond. I think an armed attack and an armed invasion are a little bit different. And it looks like Putin is putting in clauses that give him a reason not to respond if such a thing happens. And of course, Japan has a painful experience of just how valuable Russian treaties are. In 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression treaty. Only 4 years later, Russia, after the Soviet Union, rather, after America dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima, they tore up the treaty and invaded Japan and took the 4 northern islands. So Japan knows very well that a treaty with Russia is not worth the paper it's printed on. So is it a game changer? I don't think so. It makes sense for them to signal their close friendship. Putin, in this press conference with reporters, said that South Korea doesn't have to worry because the conditions of Russia taking part is an armed invasion. And as far as I know, Putin said, South Korea does not plan to invade North Korea. And also he said that Russia right now is in a state of war, but North Korea is not obliged to take part in the war because when the Ukrainians invaded the Donbass, his words, not mine, the Donbass was not part of Russia then. So this treaty doesn't apply. So there's lots of clauses that condition the joining of Russia. So I don't think it's a game changer.
Well, that's fascinating, Ken. I think this is great research there and great reporting. And I think you convinced me that Putin, at least for the rest of the world, is trying to say nothing has changed. And yet, it seems that for Kim Jong-un, things have changed because he's going to get stuff that he otherwise wouldn't get. And Nahal, I wonder. And by the way, the Chinese don't seem to be particularly happy with this either, exactly, because the North Koreans are their ally. But what was your reporting in Washington on this? How did the U.S. react to this? Did they see this as more an act of Putin desperation, or a solidifying of a relationship that seemed to be growing over the last few months because of the war?
My sense was that they saw us both. Like, I have not done any direct reporting on this, but it's more like, osmosis. So if others have heard different things, please let me know. But my sense of what I read and saw was just, there's not panic. It's sort of not entirely surprising. It has seemed like a trend. The fact that these quote unquote treaties or whatever were pretty opaque, I think, it underscores everything Ken just said, and which everybody, the U.S. officials would probably generally agree with. Definitely the sense of desperation from Putin that he would have to go and be so nice to Kim Jong-un. I highly recommend the Daily Show's segment on this. It was absolutely hilarious about how Kim hosted him and the way Putin acted, and it was pretty funny. I will say I think that one of the things that it did do, though, in terms of Washington, is that it shined a spotlight on the U.S. lack of progress on North Korea, and just how I don't want to use the word hapless. I'm not even sure. Like it's kind of like, if there's nothing there, then what is the adjective you use? What are we doing to do anything about North Korea, which clearly has advanced its weapons capabilities, its nuclear capabilities? Now it's doing this thing with Russia. Like, it's not just about Russia. It's also about our inability the West in general, not just the US, but the inability to grapple with this North Korean dictator and his country, the danger that it can pose to the world. And it just struck me that he apparently Kim Jong-un is now 40, and so I'm guessing that he will be approaching a midlife crisis pretty soon. And so it makes me wonder what he's got planned for that. So yeah, overall, again, not too much panic from my sense, but others, please correct me if I'm wrong. But I do think it very much shows that, like, our North Korea policy is I lack an adjective. If anyone wants to fill it in, let me know.
AWOL, missing.
I thought of two. I mean, there were two things that occurred to me. One was, did Kim get any help or promises of help from Russia to get its ballistic missiles improved? That's something he wants, right? And Russia's perfectly capable of offering it if it wants to. And obviously, North Korea has been shipping lots of missiles and shells in particular to Russia. And even if, as some suggest, a large proportion of them are duds, there are a lot of them, and a lot more than we're producing. So there is a quid pro quo, and I would think Kim would ask for something, but I don't know what that is. But that's one of the things that worries me. The second thing I think Putin was doing was reminding China that though Russia is like the little brother maybe to this alliance, it has agency. And North Korea was, as you yourself said, Ivo, kind of a Chinese little ally. And so this was interesting. And then Nahal brought up a very good point, which is we were relying on China to help control North Korea and its nuclear program, just as we were relying on China and Russia to help control Iran's nuclear program. And in both cases, they're missing. They have different views now. So part of our policy is in tatters just because we're no longer getting that kind of help from China and Russia, who have banded together well or badly, for long or not, I don't really know, but to disrupt and what they consider to be, to use the cliche, the American-led world order. So, I mean, all these things I think are in play. Maybe we overdo them because that's our job, but those are the things that struck me at least.
I mean, I think your point is well taken. I mean, as one of those pieces of the order that everybody seemed to accept, at least the countries that had nuclear weapons, is that the nuclear club should stay small and preferably only have those who have currently nuclear weapons, and maybe some who currently have nuclear weapons shouldn't have them, like the Pakistanis and the Indians. And that's one thing that everybody agreed on. And I think you're right, Steve, that that's no longer a top priority. It's clearly not a top priority with regard to Iran. Both China and Russia, for different reasons, oil and weapons and everything else, are no longer putting any pressure on Iran and its nuclear program, which the Iranians have just decided they're going to massively expand their centrifuge capabilities. And you're right on North Korea, where the nuclear program is expanding quite a bit. And the key to there is actually missile, the ability to launch nuclear warheads on missiles, which they have been working on. And to the extent Russia is helping with that, and satellite navigation, which is the other thing we know they helped with in the last time those two met. All of which is worrisome because it demonstrates that competition about who controls what in the world is more important than agreement on maintaining the nuclear club as a small club. So point well, I think is an important point. Nahal?
Yeah, and just to be clear on that, I mean, I haven't heard the U.S. make a big deal about India and Pakistan's nuclear weapons programs in a long, long time, and that's probably because the U.S. had its own interests in not making a big deal of those programs. So, I mean, it's one of those situations where you always, whataboutism is not like a great philosophy, but I mean, you just hand people an easy one where it's like, well, why is Russia doing this with North Korea? And it's nuclear. It's like, well, our own history is not particularly consistent on that front either.
Well, and if you want to go to India, Pakistan, there's also Israel, which we don't talk about at all when it comes to nuclear weapons. And this country that faces an existential threat from Iran also has 100 nuclear weapons. Anyway, Ken, I mean, for just a final point for you, I mean, this is one of the worries that keeps Japan and South Korea to some extent up at night. The fact that you have a highly unpredictable leader that has nuclear weapons capabilities, shooting missiles over their territory, etc., is not a prospect that anyone in Tokyo or Seoul views lightly.
That is true, but it came to me this morning that Kim Jong-un has actually been in office longer than Xi Jinping. If you look across Asia, he is one of the longest serving leaders, so he's not a rookie. Like Yoon Suk-yeol is a rookie when it comes to diplomacy. So I think we need to take that into account. Japan is really worried about this new partnership between China, Russia, and North Korea. Some people will throw in Iran. But we're watching very carefully to what extent they are glued by interests and to what extent they're really united in trying to create a new order that is more comfortable for autocracies. We don't know. Just for this North Korea-Russia collaboration, how it looks in the eyes of China. I had a chance to talk to a Chinese diplomat the other day off the record, and he was saying that, you guys say that China has influence on North Korea. It's not that easy. Our influence is limited. And to give an example, it's like how Biden feels about Netanyahu. That's how we feel about Kim Jong-un. So, yeah, you're a friend, but they just don't listen. And to give an analogy of this Russia-North Korea alliance, it would be like Israel today signing a peace treaty, an alliance with India. So from Washington's perspective, it would be like, okay, India's a friend, Israel's a friend, but what on earth are you doing signing an alliance? You're supposed to be talking with us. So I think that's the kind of mentality that China feels today, because at the end, Xi Jinping's goal is to create a Sino-centric world order. And teaming with Russia, teaming with North Korea for that goal makes sense. But I don't think China would aid Russia to the extent that it would imply a cost to China itself. That's why they're not providing the weapons, because that's clearly a red line that would trigger sanctions. So I think that's to the extent to which China will team with Russia and North Korea.
Well, it used to be the enemy of my enemy is my friends, but now even that's not necessarily the case anymore. So that's how complicated it is. But speaking of complicated, Nahal, let's switch over to the highly uncomplicated view of the foreign policy in a second Trump administration. Foreign Affairs, as is its wont, every 4 years invites either candidates or, in this case, surrogates to write about the foreign policy of the candidates. And Robert O'Brien, as I said on the onset, the fourth and last national security advisor to Donald Trump, has written a piece in Foreign Affairs, which is well worth reading because it's worth reading. It's an enlightening set of views about what both happened in the Trump administration the first time around and what we can expect in a new Trump administration should Donald Trump get reelected. So, Nahal, what struck you? I'm sure. What do you see? What was the main theme, and what struck you in the way that O'Brien described both the past and the future?
Well, it was a very selective description of the past. And an ambitious vision for the future. Ambitious in the sense that he put a lot of ideas out there that I'm not sure even Trump is going to go along with. But in any case, some of the things that Robert O'Brien suggested include, and a lot of the piece, to be clear, was about China and how China is the biggest threat to the U.S. and the things the United States needs to do. So, for instance, he suggested that the U.S. should have a complete decoupling economically from China, and very high tariffs. And he even suggested deploying the entire United States Marine Corps to the Pacific, as well as sending way more weapons to U.S. partners in the Pacific, such as Indonesia, the Philippines, weapons and ships, things like that. And, along these same kinds of lines, he wants the U.S. to up its game on the nuclear front, kind of refurbishing the nuclear triad and actually testing new nuclear weapons in the real world, as he put it, not just by using computer models. Now, there were other parts to this. When it comes to Ukraine, he said that he expects Trump to continue to provide lethal aid to Ukraine, but that would be financed by European countries, while keeping the door open to diplomacy with Russia and kind of keeping Moscow not sure where he stands by being unpredictable. That whole section was like, it just kind of was meaningless in a lot of ways, because it's like, what does that mean for Trump? What will he actually do? And I just am guessing that O'Brien kind of wrote that knowing that he couldn't really go so far as to say that Trump is just going to throw Ukraine to the wolves. But it was questionable. He really also spent a significant amount of time on the need to invest a lot more in the military, including having way more ships for the Navy. He has a thing for ships. But he also said that, and my read of it was that this has to be done with a smarter budget, not a bigger one. So I was wondering, for instance, where is the money then going to come from? And, my read of it was like, basically, there's just going to be a lot more money going to the defense budget and maybe less money elsewhere. And so you're going to have a foreign policy that's basically controlled by the Defense Department, and maybe with some input from agencies that deal with like trade and commerce. But if you're like a diplomat at the State Department, I don't think Robert O'Brien has a lot of use for you. I'm not sure, again, that Trump is going to really follow any or all of these things. I actually think Trump would love to be the first president to say that he presided over $1 trillion defense budget. Of course, he could still, shrink other parts of the budget to make up for that. But this was written in a way that it was ambiguous. I think if you overall read the piece, I was really struck by how much kind of basic context and nuance and implications he left out, Robert O'Brien. He kind of elided over certain facts. He talked about how Trump is a peacemaker, and he mentioned things like the peace deal with the Taliban and the Abraham Accords and Kosovo and Serbia, these economic agreements. And it was just like, well, yeah, like if you look at it from a very narrow lens and just for like a few months, then maybe that's fair. But if you look at the implications over time, it's probably a more complicated picture that than he lays out. I will say I appreciate that he says that there's no Trump doctrine. I've always thought that the idea of like a doctrine for a president is kind of silly, because they do so many different things, and to try to narrow it down to one thing is kind of a joke. And like if you look at like how many attempts people have made to try to define the Biden doctrine since Biden has been president, much less over his whole career. It's kind of amazing because every year some big new thing happens and they're like, oh, this is now the Biden doctrine. And I just kind of think it's kind of silly. But in the fact that O'Brien is saying this about Trump is, to me, it's suggested that it was just a clever way of saying that Trump is going to be inconsistent and unpredictable, which is not going to be comforting to allies, and which, to be honest, kind of undercuts the whole thesis of O'Brien's piece, because he's laying out what he would like to see Trump do, but which Trump, I don't think Trump is going to read this piece. So, again, there's a lot more to it. I do recommend everybody read it, maybe a few times. It's take it with a huge grain of salt, but do read it because it was, I will say, the most comprehensive piece I've seen from Trump world about what a foreign policy would look like. And I recently, I was talking to an African diplomat, and they were telling me that one of the reasons that they do take Trump's rhetoric seriously, like even some of the wildest things that he says, is because the Trump campaign doesn't really put out serious foreign policy papers. So they don't really have a lot of material to work with. And of course, we know Trump's history is like, doing whatever he wants on the spur of the moment. So the fact that this now exists is something that I think a lot of foreign diplomats will look at and think, okay, well, here's something we might be able to think about as a potential agenda. But I would not, ink this anywhere. I would maybe put it in pencil somewhere as a potential for the future.
No, I think that's right. And I think if the African diplomat reads the piece, he will note that it doesn't have the word Africa in it, or the word Latin America, or the word South Asia, or the word Southeast Asia, and barely the word Europe, and maybe actually, Russia a little bit. But
Ivo, that's actually a point that I'm glad you brought up, because that is another thing I noticed is, a lot of people believe that the way to challenge the rise of China is to focus on Asia, right? But my reporting and my sense is the Chinese see the whole world as the arena of competition, Africa, Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. So if you actually want to challenge the Chinese, you have to be playing on every front and every field. And I don't think the Biden administration fully gets that. I think they're getting better about it, but I don't think they fully get it yet. But to me, this piece suggested that Trump's people don't get it either.
Steve, what did you take away from this?
Well, I read it as a job application, but to a boss that isn't going to read it or is going to ask someone else to give him a 4-paragraph summary of the job application. Right? That's kind of how I read it. It was a bit bizarre. I mean, I think Nahal describes it very, 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 very well. One of the things that struck me, which, besides sending the entire Marine Corps off to Asia, struck me as so naive, is he just sort of throws in this line about Ukraine that the European Union should just immediately offer Ukraine membership, and not worry about all these, what he called bureaucratic issues. Well, the bureaucratic issues have a lot to do with rule of law, with economic clarity, with transparency, with lack of corruption, with democracy. I mean, you don't get into the European Union by waving your hand, right? But to him, it didn't matter. This just puts it into Europe's basket. So he and Trump wouldn't have to worry about it. No, I found it in that sense kind of bizarre, but it'll be, read. Trump, as we know, isn't a big reader. He's more of a talker. And, we'll see. I mean, the Heritage, everyone's spending a lot of time worrying about what the Heritage Foundation's doing. They're writing long job applications. It's just not clear Trump's going to win the election anyway, but it certainly gives us all something to shudder about, including Europeans. I'd leave it there.
Ken, your sort of take on and how was it seen in Asia?
Right. So I think diplomats across Washington had a chance to measure what Trump's foreign policy and Biden 2.0 foreign policy might look like this week and last week, because so Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher had their foreign affairs piece, which basically called for regime change, the end of a communist dictatorship in China, and followed by Robert O'Brien, who is calling, like Nahal said, a clear decoupling and more of the tariffs, 60% tariff on China. Whereas Kurt Campbell appeared at the Stimson Center last week, and he was saying, no, this is reckless to call for a regime change in China. We have enough problems as it is. We should aim for careful coexistence and admit that China is a major player and strengthen ourselves and pursue our interests in a more smart way. So on the surface, I think China would prefer a Biden administration because it's more predictable and it's not calling for regime change. But I think in the long run, and if I were Xi Jinping, I would be confident that America won't be successful in any regime change attempt because of America's track record of regime changes. And also by this complete decoupling and 60% tariff that O'Brien is advocating for, that makes it very hard for countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, and India to join. Without even asking, Trump is weakening the alliance structure that Biden has made. And I think in the long run, if I were Xi Jinping and I were trying to make the Sino-centric world order, I think a Trump administration would accelerate that path. So I have a feeling that the Chinese want Trump more than they want Biden.
I think that's very interesting. It's a good way to end. The one thing that struck me is that it starts and ends with Ronald Reagan and peace through strength, but everything in the middle had nothing to do with anything that Ronald Reagan would have advocated. This is as far removed from Reagan-esque foreign policy as you possibly can get, which is, other than the slogan, it's kind of interesting. But the idea that allies don't matter in a way that, or they matter to pay for the things that we want them to do, and everything else was pretty interesting. And last I looked, Ronald Reagan wasn't particularly fond of tariffs. He believed in open and free trade systems, and you can go on and on and on. But that's for another time. It's for another program. It's for another week. This week, thanks so much to Nahal Toosi of Politico, Steve Erlanger of the New York Times, and Ken Moriyasu of Nikkei Asia for your insights. And thank you all for tuning in. This was World Review. We'll be back next week with another edition. Until then, have a great weekend.